Ah yes, Tiny Toons. I'm sure I'm not the only 20-something here to remember this work of genius. Now, for those of you who don't know what Tiny Toons is, maybe you're too young to remember, or you just had poor taste in cartoons back in the day, I don't know. It was aired between 1990 and 1995. Basically, it was one of several kids' cartoon series created by Tom Ruegger and produced by the legendary film director Steven Spielberg. The result combined the kind of hilarity that Warner Bros. Cartoons have always been famous for, with clever scriptwriting and a special kind of wit that drew in a massive audience and was appreciated by children and adults alike. Despite its popularity, however, the show only managed 3 seasons, albeit 98 episodes worth, and since they stopped making them, whereas the likes of Bugs and Daffy are still known to kids even today, the likes of Buster and Babs Bunny have kind of slipped into an obscurity, occasionally broken only by reruns on American television. Well, fortunately, before they disappeared into obscurity, a number of games based on the license were commissioned. Well, obviously, I suppose that kinda goes without saying, since you wouldn't be here otherwise, and you have kinda been watching 3 of them for like a minute now. And since I feel like experimenting with my format, and I just happen to have 3 Tiny Toons games, this episode I'm going to be reviewing 3 of them for you. Tiny Toons Adventures for the NES, Babs' Big Break for the Game Boy, and Buster Bust Loose for the Super Nintendo. Let's start with Tiny Toons Adventures for the NES, which as far as I know was their gaming debut. The story behind Tiny Toons Adventures is, simple, to put it mildly. One day, Buster Bunny was sat at home watching TV, when suddenly Montana Max, that spoilt little shit that always made an arse of himself, appears on the television declaring that, for reasons known only to himself, he has kidnapped Babs. Upon hearing this news, Buster gathers his fellow Tiny Toons and sets off to assemble all the keys to get into Montana's mansion and rescue her. How the hell they knew where to find them, or that they even had to, is a mystery. But whatever. Now, if that story of a senseless kidnap of a damsel in distress and her rescue by a brave hero sounds familiar to you, then you won't be too surprised to find out that as soon as you jump into this game, the actual gameplay will feel very familiar to you as well. Essentially what Tiny Toons Adventures is, from story to gameplay, is a Mario Bros. Free clone, complete with obligatory stand-in for coins. Now don't take that the wrong way. In no way am I saying that that is a bad thing. Some people I've spoken to about this game have gone as far as calling this a classic. I personally wouldn't go quite that far, but I do think, although not perfect, it's actually a very good clone. The basic aim here is what you would expect from such a platformer. Through 6 worlds which range from a forest to a pirate ship, and are mostly divided up into 3 stages. You start at one end of the stage, and have to make your way to the other, navigating your way over platforming obstacles like floating platforms, pits, water, quicksand, etc., while defeating all sorts of weird enemies, which as per Mario Bros. Freestyle, you kill by jumping on their heads. And at the end of each world, you'll run into a boss encounter where you can get the key to move on to the next world. Doing all this, however, really isn't as easy as you would think. Someone clearly didn't tell the development team that although Tiny Toons garnered quite an adult audience, its main audience were kids, because this game is surprisingly challenging, to put it mildly. The reasons for this are pretty simple. For starters, rather than a health bar, we have good old-fashioned one-hit kills. There are little power-up hearts here and there which can grant you an extra hit, though not many of them, and you really do need to get these, because as well as one-hit kills, there just happen to be a holy shit ton of things out there trying to kill you. We've got the obligatory Roderick clones that throw anvils at you, fish, squid, pens, yes pens, things jumping out at you from behind walls, dogs throwing stuff at you from windows, and a lot of the time many of those listed are doing it at the same time, whilst you try to navigate bits of stage that require precision platforming skills. It can actually get pretty intense. Combine that with the fact that quite a few of the enemies are just plain cheap. Trust me when I say that you're going to become very familiar with this screen, since you are going to die again, and again, and again, and again. There are a couple of other things worth mentioning, for example loose controls that make things a little bit awkward, though you will get used to those so they're not a major problem, and the complete lack of a save feature, though on the other hand you do have unlimited continues, so it does kind of balance out. On the whole, despite some of the cheap kills, I wouldn't say that this is the bad kind of difficult. The game isn't impossibly hard, just very hard. And although it does like its cheap kills, as I've said, the majority of deaths are down to genuine challenge, and dodging the enemies is actually quite fun once you've got it down. With enough playthroughs and memorization of stage layouts, you'll be getting through these stages like a pro. Just make sure you go in fully aware of the fact that this game isn't easy, and you'll be happy. The game's stage layouts, although not exactly inspiring and clearly very Mario Bros. Free, are well designed. There are plenty of platforms to jump, a few moving platforms here and there, spikes to dodge, you know, all the typical stuff you expect from a Mario clone. There's no chance of getting lost on your way to the end, there are no near impossible jumps, and even those parts that do require precision jumping are not all that demanding, it's just the enemies that will make them tough. I also quite like the character system. Now this is their attempt to differentiate it from Mario Bros. Free slightly. Your main character throughout the game is Buster Bunny, the nearest thing to a main character the show itself actually had, and he's alright. He can run fast and most platforms are well within reach when using him thanks to his high jump. He's a decent all-rounder I suppose. In fact, you could say he's Mario. But at the beginning of each world, you're given the chance to select one of 3 secondary characters to use as well, who can be switched to during a stage via a little ball power-up that you find at various points. You've got Plucky Duck, Furball, and Dizzy, each of whom have their own special abilities that makes them worth considering. Plucky Duck can flap his wings, thus slowing his descent. Dizzy can use his trademark spin attack to kill most enemies with ease and break certain things, and Furball can climb walls. More useful than you'd think, that. Not only does this add a little extra variety to the game, but I suppose you could say it introduces a small element of strategy, since picking the right character can sometimes make getting through a world much easier, and in fact you're actually going to find yourself using them more often than you do Buster, because Buster just isn't all that useful. For example, in World 3 you have to go through this forest and navigate this section early in the stage. For me, it was a complete pain in the ass. It's extremely narrow and there are enemies everywhere. It's a death trap basically. Or you can pick Dizzy, smash your way through these blocks, and then just bypass the whole thing. The only problem is that despite the selection screen's hints, you're going to have to get your ass kicked once or twice to find the best character to use. But other than that, it's a pretty neat system. The only thing I can think to say against the game is that as good a game as it is, it bugs me how this one doesn't feel like a Tiny Toons game. It feels just like a basic Mario game with Tiny Toons characters slapped on. Yeah, I know, I'm kinda nitpicking, it's not exactly uncommon for a licensed platformer to just be a Mario clone with licensed characters slapped on, but it bothers me that this one feels so much like a Mario clone that I kinda keep expecting Mario just to bounce on screen at any moment. It just doesn't feel like it was made with any imagination, and that makes it feel very generic. Licensed games are just so much more satisfying when they make some attempt to use their license to establish some kind of identity. Take Virgin's Lion King for example. It's not exactly original as platformers go, but it looks, it sounds, and it feels the part of a Lion King game, so it's disappointing that the developers just didn't bother here. The only other thing I can think of is that once you finish this challenging game, there isn't really any reason to go back to it like hidden goodies or extra levels or anything like that, so it lacks in replay value as well. Lastly, the graphics and sound are also quite good. Everything from the characters to the environment are nice and colourful, and have a decent amount of detail to them, though I'm pretty sure I've seen better from this console, especially this far into its lifespan, but everything's reasonable enough, and there is a fair bit of slowdown at a few points, where you honestly wouldn't expect to see it on the NES, but since I am playing this on a Retro Duo, I can't confirm if this is normal or if it's just my system. Now as for sound, well, it's 90s Konami, so the music is going to be quite decent by default. It's not even remotely as good as some of their other NES games that they've produced, but the rendition of the Tiny Toons theme is quite awesome, and all the stage music is bouncy and fun for the most part, and is overall pretty good stuff for the game, though none of it is going to stick in your head afterwards. Now a quick note to Retro Duo owners, if you own a PAL version of this game, you are going to have some serious problems with the sound. I had to use YouTube to rate the music, I'm afraid, because it just gets majorly fucked up on the clone console. So if you want to hear the music, either play it on an NES or get the NTSC version. Well, there's the NES version of Tiny Toons Adventures. Like I said at the beginning, I wouldn't go as far as calling it a classic, it's far too copy and paste for that, but it's a very good platformer in its own right nonetheless. If you're looking for a decent 8-bit platformer, you like a decent challenge, and you don't mind how Mario-free it feels, then you will find a game that for a $5 just for the cartridge offers up enough to satisfy your platforming needs, and I can highly recommend it to you. Next up, we have Tiny Toons' first entry on the Nintendo Game Boy, Babs' Big Break, released in 1992, shortly after the NES version, and also produced by Konami. Now, this one's going to be quite a short review. I actually had quite a bit of trouble writing this one up because, to be honest, there really isn't all that much to say. Like the NES version, it's an almost exact Mario clone, but there's an awful lot less to it. The story is exactly what you would expect. Total bollocks, and totally irrelevant. Babs Bunny, despite the fact that she's already at the Acme University, has decided she wants to go off and become an actress, and sets off to the theatre to start her career. Upon hearing this, Buster and co decide to follow her to make sure she doesn't get into trouble, which is good, because Montana Max is planning to buy the theatre and get rid of it. Yeah, anyway, the game itself is basically an inoffensive little platformer. You're given control of Buster Bunny and 2 other characters, Hampton and Plucky, who you can switch between at any given time through the game's pause menu. Not that there's any real reason to do so, since there's no difference between them aside from the items that you throw. Everything else in the game will basically lead me to repeat the previous review if I try to go into too much detail. You basically just walk around the levels at a very slow pace this time, jumping between platforms, boffing things on the head, and throwing stuff at them in this case, collecting stand-ins for coins, though this time you also get to bounce around on what are basically question mark blocks to get extra items, and at the end of each of the 4 stages, yep, just 4, you'll come across an easy to beat boss. They have made a small effort to make things a little more interesting by tasking you with finding a specific character in each stage, without whom you can't progress. For example, in the first stage you have to find Dizzy, who will tunnel underneath this mountain for you. It does kind of work because it gives you an incentive to explore the stage, but it won't take you long to find them since these stages are also quite simple. And none of this will really take you very long to do either, since aside from loose controls, it's very, very easy. Having a health bar really helps, and very, very short. You'll be done in about 40 minutes in a single playthrough. The graphics are alright. All the characters are actually pretty detailed, and the animations and such are alright. You can't complain for the Game Boy. But the music is crap. Most of it is just a rendition of the Tiny Toons theme being repeated again and again. It's a good rendition, but when you've heard it for about the 20th time, you will start to lose that appreciation. There are a few other tracks dotted around, but they're kind of lifeless and totally forgettable. Well, that's pretty much it. I can't think of anything else to say about it. It's not a bad platformer, it's not broken, the stage designs are okay and all that, the controls are fine, if a bit loose, but then there's nothing interesting about it in any way. I would say that it would get pretty dull pretty quick, but the game's over before dullness gets a chance to set in. I think the best thing to say about this is what I said at the start. It's an inoffensive little Game Boy platformer. You can find it dirt cheap in the wild these days. I'd say about a maximum of a $5, often much lower for the cartridge. Just pop it in your Game Boy, have a little fun for the time it lasts, then never play again. Now, last but by absolutely no means least, I present you with Tiny Toons' Buster Bust Loose on the Super Nintendo. Although I've left this one till last, this one is the star of the episode so far as I'm concerned. I haven't played nearly all there is to offer in Tiny Toons games, but I feel quite confident in saying that this one might be the best one out there, and apparently I'm not the only one. IGN actually ranked this as number 99 of their best 100 games for the Super Nintendo. Not bad for a system with so many platformers. The actual game itself is very much a typical platformer. It's quite Mario inspired just like the other two, but it's a much better one than the other two. With much tighter controls than the NES or Game Boy versions, you once again take control of Buster Bunny. Just Buster this time, no extra characters to play here I'm afraid, with the aim, as usual, being to reach the other side of the stage, navigating platforming obstacles and beating up enemies, though this time you do get to beat them with a nifty little jump kick. And on the odd occasion, like many platformers, you'll take on a boss, like Dizzy here, which although easy, do require a little bit more effort than simply boffing them on the head. Typical platformer though it may be, there are a few reasons why I feel this one stands out a little bit more than the Tiny Toons games I've played so far. For starters, the stage design here actually seems a lot more varied and imaginative than its NES or Game Boy counterparts, and stands up quite well to comparison to other platformers of the time. There's nothing unusual to platformers here, but the designers have just been a lot more inventive. They've made more use of moving platforms, stage layouts that move around a bit rather than just remaining static, like this collapsing train bridge, and there's even a little bit of interactivity with the environment, although most of it does involve blowing shit up. Most important, I feel, is Buster's dash ability. Regulated by a charge meter in the top left corner, holding down the L or R buttons will set Buster into a dash, which aside from making him run fast, allows him to jump large gaps and even run up walls, and also jump between them on the way up. So you're going to be finding yourself travelling vertically as much as you are sideways. Like the other things on this list, it's not exactly a massive addition, but the designers have used it to good effect, to make the stages just feel more interesting and lively and a little less predictable than those offered by the other two games in this episode. And it goes quite a long way to separating it from the Mario games it's based on, and helping give the game a character all of its own. And that's what I think I'm trying to drive at. Unlike the other two games, this one actually feels like a Tiny Toons game. The main reason is that unlike the other two games, which could basically be any old platformer which just happened to have Tiny Toon characters tacked on, and don't worry, this one features many of your favourite characters from the show too, the development team that made this one appears to have actually watched more than 1 or 2 episodes of the show, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were fans, because like I said, this one feels like a Tiny Toons game. They haven't done anything massive to pull this off. The reason is in the tiny details and certain design choices here and there that really pull it off. Take the story, for example. Unlike the other two games that I've played so far, the story is not just a throwaway, oh Babs is in danger, let's rescue her sort of Mario storyline. In fact, there isn't an overarching storyline at all. Instead, each stage is presented like a little episode from the show, each one starting with a little introduction, usually from Buster and another character, in the same style as seen in the show, before you get into the stage properly. Aside from that, the scenarios for the stages you'll find yourself in actually kind of make sense for a Tiny Toons game, and at least some of them are based on actual episodes of the show. They range from navigating your way through the Acme University to avoid being late for class, to a particularly charming spoof of Star Wars, in which Plucky Duck plays the part of Duck Vader. Basically it's an homage to episode 2. I know he didn't actually do that in the show, he fought Duck Vader, but whatever, I can live with that. I also quite like the fact that the dev team appear to have actually had a go at including some of the show's sense of humour in the game. There's not much of it, but it's nice that they tried. Now, despite the fact that I love the game, there are a few things that I'm not too keen on. Most significant of which is that while the NES game was really hard, some might argue a little too hard, Buster Bust Loose takes it way too far the other way and makes things too easy. The fact that you have a health bar now probably helps, and aside from 1 or 2 sections that will catch you out here and there, the platforming isn't too hard for an experienced player, but the main reason to me is that there aren't really that many enemies running around compared to the NES game. Not necessarily a bad thing, but the ones that are running around are very easy to dispatch via Buster's jump kick. You might say a little too easy to dispatch. I think Buster is just a tad overpowered. Whatever the reason, although it's not a total pushover, it's much easier to get through on normal difficulty. Oh, that's something to mention, there are difficulty levels now. Easy, which frankly isn't worth looking at, though it does give you access to the password feature, normal, and finally hard, which basically just starts you at every stage with 1 heart, and it doesn't really make things all that much harder. The game is also very short. The stages are quite big and varied, but there are only 6 of them in total, and they won't take you too long to get through. A typical playthrough on normal difficulty shouldn't take you more than about 2 hours, I don't think, and there really isn't much incentive to come back once you've finished, aside from to have a crack at harder difficulty, and the fact that it is just quite fun to play it again. Though in the face of the sheer quality of the rest of the game, these are all just little issues that shouldn't really impact your enjoyment. I just wish it was longer. Now, presentation-wise, Buster Bust Loose is quite awesome, although it's not exactly blowing the hardware wide open. Everything you see, from the well-animated characters to just the background of the Luniversity storeroom, is full of detail and colour in just the way you would expect something from the Tiny Toons universe to be, and it goes quite a long way to helping the game look and feel the part of a Tiny Toons game. Even the backgrounds sometimes have something going on back there. I especially like the Star Wars spoof, where you can watch a fleet do battle in the background as you plod through the stage. The music is also very good stuff. Again, it's not Konami's best work, there's nothing here you'll be humming to yourself later on, but it's all great stuff. Aside from that awesome Tiny Toons theme, which is rendered nicely here, The whole soundtrack is high quality stuff, it's animated, it's fun, and it just fits in so well with the game. Well, that's Buster Bust Loose. Now, I'm not saying that it's the best platformer of all time, but it didn't get to number 99 of the IGN Best SNES Games of all time for nothing. It has everything a Tiny Toons game needs. Like the other games in the review, it's got the cast and it's got the music, but as a whole it feels more like a Tiny Toons game than the previous two, just thanks to a whole bunch of little things like the stage intro and the fact that the development team actually seem to have made some effort to design scenarios that make some sense in the Tiny Toons universe. And it also helps that it has generally more imaginative and varied level design, making for a game that I feel is just generally better overall, and actually a very good game in its own right, if a little too easy and too short. Definitely worth the $5 it'll cost you just for the cartridge. Right, that's it for this episode. There you have 3 Tiny Toons games. There will be more to come at some point, as there do appear to be quite a few Tiny Toon games out there, though since you know which one's my favourite, I'm interested to know which of the 3 is yours. Anyway, thanks for watching another episode of Retro Strike. I'll see you next time.